have discussed how the shutter and aperture of a camera work, and now before we can really understand how we can create the perfect exposure, there is one more thing. The ISO we use when we are shooting pictures is as important in creating the correct exposure in the photograph as manipulating both the shutter and aperture. All of these basic functions of the camera are interrelated and combine to create our final output, the well-exposed photograph. ISO actually stands for the International Organisation of Standardisation and simply means it is a measurement of the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. That means that the sensor will be more or less sensitive to how much light falls on it and will need to be adjusted according to what shooting conditions apply. By that, I mean whether you are shooting in a very dark situation or in a very bright one. The measurements for ISO are in an exponential range and start at a low sensitivity of generally 100 ISO and range all the way through, on some cameras, to 6400 ISO, which is very sensitive to light. The range in between 200, 400, 800, 1600 and 3200 are each doubly more sensitive to light than each of the previous numbers. And here are the buttons to press to change your ISO. Nowadays, in all digital cameras, you can easily change the ISO settings to accommodate the kind of lighting conditions you encounter, which is one of the great technological breakthroughs since the era of film. Using anything but the lower range of ISOs has the drawback of creating noise in the image. Noise in a digital negative is similar to graininess in old film formats, in that it is more apparent at a higher ISO. It is dissimilar in that it is a fragmentation of the digital signal, and it is sometimes quite ugly. While sometimes its use is quite effective, noise can soften an image so that the edges of an object become quite fuzzy. At 100 ISO, the quality of the edges of an object you have focused on are far sharper. Still, if you are in a very low light condition, the ability to change your ISO to 1600, which is very sensitive to light, from 100 ISO, which is good in bright light, is very handy. The shutter and the aperture work in unison with ISO to enable us to create an exposure. As I have explained, each of these functions individually control the amount of light that falls on the sensor and how the sensor reads that light. We know that aperture settings are measured in f-stops, shutter settings in split-second intervals, and the sensitivity to light of the sensor is measured in ISO increments. So while we understand how these functions all work, how can we possibly tell what light is falling on the sensor and how do we measure it? When I was an assistant, we used to play a game where we would guesstimate the right settings to put our cameras on when we wanted to make the right exposure. How we checked whether we were right in those days was with a handheld light meter. While DSLR cameras all have light meters and you have a range of different settings that you can apply to the situation you're shooting to best create the exposure, for me, the only way to completely control what I shoot and how I want to shoot it is when I have my camera set on manual. There are 4 standard settings on modes on most DSLR cameras. Program, which generally means that the camera will operate completely automatically and decide all of the variable functions itself. That is, the camera will think for you to achieve the correct exposure. It won't, however, think artistically. TV stands for shutter priority, which means that if you set the shutter speed, the camera will automatically choose the correct aperture to accompany it. AV, or aperture priority, which means that you can select the aperture setting you want to use and the camera will work out a shutter speed for you. And then there's manual mode. In manual mode, you decide exactly how your image will be photographed and what effects that you will realise in the final image. In DSLR cameras, you can view the light readings on a meter that you can see through the viewfinder and also on the preview panel at the back of the camera. Most standard light meters have a sliding scale with intervals marked in between. Normally, at one end you will see a +2 and at the other end you will see a -2. In the middle you will see a 0. Underneath this, a small indicator will be apparent. Basically, when you manipulate the aperture, shutter and ISO in unison, and the indicator shows under the 0, you have the correct exposure. While there are lots of tricks to getting the correct exposure for print, I won't have time to talk about them in this course. Earlier I mentioned that the aperture and the shutter have a reciprocal relationship. By that I mean that when you open the aperture right up, you need to choose a faster shutter speed to balance out the amount of light that is hitting the sensor. Or when you are using a very slow shutter speed, you will have to use a closed down aperture. This relationship works on a sliding scale, so if you were to take 6 photos of one object in the same lighting conditions, the first thing you would do is select your ISO to be appropriate. Next, you would start at, say, f4 and set the camera at 1/500th of a second. This would give you a limited depth of field, but if the object was moving quickly, you would get a frozen in time image. The next step up would be f5.6 at 2/50th of a second, then f8 at 1/25th of a second, f11 at 1/60th of a second, f16 at 1/30th of a second, and then f22 at 1/15th of a second. These would all yield exactly the same exposure, but in each a variation would occur in the depth of field and the level of blur in the image. In the last example, blur would occur if what you were shooting moved or if you had shaky hands. The same sort of reciprocal scale would occur in any other given situation. So if you had a very bright light, for instance, but you wanted a very low depth of field, then you would need to use a very fast shutter speed to compensate. But you would still gain the same exposure if you used a more closed down aperture, but maybe not as fast a speed. You would create a different image, but the same exposure. So now's the time to go out and practice with all of those dials and buttons, because in the next lesson, I'm going to set a little exercise for you to do. Until then, happy snapping.